They slapped a glossy flyer on my gate like it was a welcome mat sunset gala at Cedar Point. Big script, smiling faces, a VIP sponsor list, and right underneath it, in smaller type that looked official, a permit number. First 3 sentences. I owned that strip of dune longer than the HOA had been a rumor, and someone was trying to sell my sand to a party. I remember standing there, coffee gone cold in my hand, thinking, I have to be dreaming. My name is Eli Monroe. My wife, June, and I bought that place because nobody else wanted beachfront that stubborn. Nobody else wanted the work, the sea oats, the fence posts, the turtle patrol. To us, it was a small war worth fighting. To Marla Haynes, the president of the Cedar Point Homeowners Association, it was a line on a ledger. When I went down to her house that afternoon, polite at first, because I'm not heroic, I'm just a man who loves his dirt, she opened the door like she'd been waiting for me, smile tight, suit crisp, and she flipped a paper toward me the way someone might flip their hand at a dog. We got a permit, she said, slow, like she wanted me to feel small. Everything's legal. She showed me something that looked official, a stamped permit with a county seal that could have fooled anyone who didn't know a property mark from a parking ticket. I took a photo, because that's all you can do when the world hands you a page and a smirk. June watched from the porch, fists pressed into the wood rail, and later when I look back, I can still see the way she held herself steady, tired, like she'd been practicing not losing for years. They came the next week with trucks and a stage and a man who called himself an event manager but looked like he'd been hired off an app. They rolled the rope back and set up string lights, the kind of lights that promise Instagram and forget the sand. A deputy showed up, one of those guys who look official until you learn the cost of their loyalty, and he nodded like this was an ordinary day, an ordinary dispute. People drifted over, smiling, some with wine. The crowd didn't know why the line mattered. They saw an invitation, and that's what they saw, an evening. I started filming. Not because I wanted to be a hero, but because evidence is patient and memory is not. I shot the truck tires sinking in, the surveyor's little pink flags being ignored, the stage crew laughing while they stomped down the drift. I filmed Marla talking into a headset like a woman who believed she ran the coastline. I filmed the deputy handing his clipboard back to her with that same nod. Later, when the storm broke and the foam machine, yes, a foam machine, like some fake nightclub on the sand, sprayed chemical fluff into the dunes, burying nests and uprooting sea oats, those clips would look sickeningly mundane. We're running a community event, Marla kept saying, voice syrup slick. People pay for memories. There was a kid, Toby, maybe 17, hoodie and a skateboard, who lived 2 streets over, and like my dog. He snuck around with a phone, shaky and honest, and caught a moment nobody thought mattered. Marla slipping a small envelope across the deputy's palm when the cameras were turned. It was a motion too quick to be theatrical, but too precise to be accidental. Toby sent it to me while the party fizzled under rain, his voice a whisper. Eli, you seeing this? We watched it back together like men who had been given a match and a pile of dry leaves. That night the wind came in hard. I remember standing on the porch, the world turning into wet film, lights wobbling, people running like confetti. The foam machine, some rented monstrosity they'd powered to make a viral moment, coughed out a thick, chemical-smelling froth that rolled over the dune like artificial winter. In the scramble, a stretcher of burlap came loose. A volunteer trampled toward the water, and somewhere right in front of the stage, a clutch of turtle eggs got crushed underfoot. I can still hear June's quiet little sound, not a scream, more like a breaking, and I remember thinking that breaking is where the story chooses its side. We filed complaints, to the county, to wildlife agencies, to anyone with a stamp and a conscience. The county clerk told us the permit number was a forgery, a sequence that had never existed. The wildlife officer, Rios, came down and walked the dune with a kind of sorrow only people who work with living things know, and he wrote things in his notebook that made me stop breathing. Someone in the HOA office, the treasurer, a man named Cal who'd always seemed like a calculator with a pulse, walked into my garage one morning with greasy palms and a ledger that smelled like trouble. He handed it to me like handing over a confession. I didn't want to, he said. But I couldn't sit while she printed our names on a check and ran off with it. The ledger, the video, the clerk's ink, the wildlife report, they stacked into a thing that looked less and less like a neighbor squabble and more like a criminal picture. We had petty names, forged permit, trespass, environmental damage. We had heavier ones too: bribery, embezzlement, abuse of office. I'm not proud of how vindictive I felt at times. It felt good, in a dull, animal way, to know the person who'd smiled at me with that paper in hand had feet of clay. But it was never just vindication, not for me. It was about the people who'd come down the beach since before my grandparents breathed. It was about responsibilities you keep even when the bank balance says you could turn your back. Marla acted like a queen whose court was a spreadsheet. In meetings, she wore those smiles that cut, and when I confronted her in public, "You can't do this," I said, and she spat the words back at me like a coin. "Watch me." She had a line of allies, people who'd been promised repairs, a reputation, or a slice of a deal. That's how power grows, not by thunder, but by little agreements signed in back rooms. We took our evidence to a prosecutor who'd seen more corruption than a small town should have to know. He watched the footage with a face that was unreadable, and then he did the thing heroes do in movies. He filed charges. There was a bulldozer day, because of course there was. Marla hired a crew to stabilize a part of the dune, and the next thing you know, there was a blade cutting where the sea oats used to be. The town split. Neighbors on both sides showed up with signs, and with shovels, and with threats that were mostly words until somebody shoved a shovel toward a back tire. Rios and an environmental crew parked their trucks and read citations like a man reading a list of sins. For a while it felt like the world was held together by paper and people showing up: citations, handcuffs, witnesses with shaky mouths, and that, oddly, felt like the only magic left. The courtroom was less dramatic than TV makes it seem, but every precedent inside it was heavy. The prosecutor played the envelope video, and I watched Marla's face go from manager to defendant in a way that slowed time. Cal testified like a man finally relieved of a weight. He read out numbers that proved what the ledger suggested: funds rerouted, invoices invented. Rios walked the jury through the smell of foam and the way it clings to feathers of birds, to turtle eggs, to things that are supposed to survive. Toby sat beside June and I, hands clenched so tight his knuckles were white, and when it was his turn he said, plainly, "I filmed it because it felt wrong. Simple. Terrible. True. They found her guilty on a handful of counts: fraud, tampering with public records, bribery. The deputy was suspended, then charged. The HOA was put under receivership, which is a fancy way of saying the organization that promised community was being taken apart so it could be fixed. The beach didn't heal overnight. We planted sea oats for months. We raised money for a hatchling program. We watched the first little turtles bob their way to the water like miracles that had been on a delay. The hardest part, the thing that stayed with me, wasn't the verdict or the receipts. It was the quiet after the noise. Standing there, June and I on the dune, hands dirty with sand and roots, watching the sunrise pull a pale seam across the water, I felt how fragile stewardship is. It isn't made of laws alone. It's made of people who show up, again and again, to do the boring work. Fencing, planting, picking up the little plastics before they find their way into lungs of birds. Justice did its part. The community did the rest. That steadiness mattered. So tell me, where do you draw your line? Have you ever stood up when someone tried to take more than they deserved? Is justice the law, or is it the people who keep showing up? Drop your story below. Tell me who you think was right, who was wrong, and what justice should look like when the dust settles. If this kind of thing matters to you, hit subscribe, share your 2 cents, and let's map out the small fights that build a better coast.